All right, hi guys. So we're gonna go ahead now and talk about inverse trig functions. Yesterday we learned about the domain and range of the 6 trig functions. I know that can be a kind of confusing, weird topic, but we're just going to use a little bit of that today because we have to make sure we understand how inverse functions work, and that's related to domain and range. So just to remind us, we've talked about inverse trig functions a little bit already, but to review a couple of basic important ideas, when we use a trig function, sine of theta for example, we plug an angle into the function and a ratio comes out. Okay, so for example, if we plug 30 degrees in, we know that sine of 30 degrees is 1/2. Now when we do the inverse function, we'll recall that the inverse function reverses the domain and range. So I won't use theta because it's not an angle going in. Instead of an angle going in, we have a trig ratio going into the inverse, and coming out is an angle measure. Okay, so angles go into trig functions, ratios come out, ratios go into inverses, angles come out. Okay, so we want to keep that in mind. What that means is essentially when you go from a function to its inverse, we've known this since algebra 1 probably, maybe algebra 2, that when you go from a function to its inverse, really all we're doing is switching the x and y values. In other words, switching the domain and range values. Okay, so that's going to be relevant. That's why we had to talk about yesterday about domain and range, because when we find the inverse functions today, we need to talk about how we switch those domain and range. But first, some notational stuff. So a trig function, each of the trig functions has an inverse trig function, and their inverse trig functions have sort of a special name notation. Okay, so if we have sine of theta, its inverse trig function, we've been calling it just inverse sine. Okay, there is another notation for it, and that's what we're learning today. Is we call this the arc sine function, and I'll try to explain in a minute why we call it the arc sine function. But that's the name that we're going to give the inverse function. So it's important to recognize that that -1 notation that we've been using, it means the exact same thing as the arc sine function. They're the exact same thing, two different names for the same thing. Okay, so we're kind of not necessarily learning anything new. We're just giving a new notation to the inverse function that we've already known. Cosine of theta, its inverse, could be denoted with the -1 inverse notation, and we would call that arc cosine of x. And then lastly, tangent of theta, its inverse, could be called tan inverse. Tan with the -1 notation there is also called the arctangent function. Okay, so this is kind of the new notation, the new idea for the day. And in the next video, we're going to talk about how to talk about the domain and range of these functions, and then we'll get into how to actually apply these inverse functions.